that, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Ben Wilder, Dr. Julio Betancourt, Dr. Kim Franklin, and Dr. Catherine Jarnovich. Ben is a biogeographer, botanist, and desert ecologist whose research looks at the origin and future of the Sonoran Desert. He is co-founder and director of the Next Generation Sonoran Desert Researchers. His scientific and conservation efforts strive to combine multiple disciplines and perspectives to better understand and care for the desert that drives his passion. Julio is a USGS scientist emeritus who made seminal contributions to understanding how climate variability and change drive regional drought, flood, and fire frequencies in the US, and defined baselines of environmental change at seasonal to millennial timescales in the Americas. He co-founded the long-running USA National Phenology Network and helped launch the Southern Arizona Buffelgrass Coordination Center, an award-winning multi-jurisdictional partnership to address bufflegrass invasion in the Sonoran Desert. Kim is the Conservation Science Manager at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum. She co-founded the Sonoran Desert Cooperative Weed Management Area in 2018, and for the past 5+ years, she has worked closely with local, state, and federal agencies on the management of invasive plant species within the Sonoran Desert region. She also collaborates with scientists inside and outside of academia to facilitate research that addresses the most critical knowledge gap in invasive species management. Catherine is a research ecologist at the USGS Fort Collins Science Center. She works to address multiple agencies and groups with species distributions, focusing on invasive plant species to develop watch lists and inform search activities from local to national scales. She has also worked with agencies to investigate alternative management scenarios for invasive plants to inform decisions on management actions. We're pleased to have everyone with us today, and with that, I'll turn it over to them, beginning with Ben.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. All right, let's tell me how we're looking here. Able to see the screen at full dimension?
Looks great. Yep.
All right, excellent. Cool. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And we're really happy to be here and share a lot of research and thinking that we've been doing on this topic. I'll also mention that the previous presentation by the consortium of last month is on very similar topics, and I would say kind of as a pair, these are going to be really hopefully informative for all of us as we try to understand what's happening, what is happening with the changing role of fire in the desert. So we're going to get into it. We have a lot we want to share with you. And first, the work that we're going to be talking about today largely comes from a paper we put together in 2021, but we're trying to understand the events of 2020 and a lot of the fires in the desert we saw. That was part of a special issue in the Frontiers of Ecology and Evolution, and just wanted to recognize we had a lot of collaborators on that work, and that work really, what we're talking about today reflects the body of work of a lot of great people. So one of the things that really caught my attention in recent years is the scale of fire as change within global climate change. And we're seeing this across the world. We saw it strongly in 2020, the fires in Eastern Australia. Same thing in about this time of the year, again in 2020, the fires throughout California. This summer, the fires in Canada, also fires in Greece. It's really dramatic and alarming, I would say, in terms of the scale of burning that we're seeing. So I think it's important to put the fire in the desert in kind of a larger context of fires as change in the global scale. Looking now a little more closely here into the US, this is fire data for the last 40 years or so, both in terms of, on the left, number of kind of area burned, and then number of fires there on the right. And two things I think to pull away from this image, among others, is the increased kind of size and frequency and number of fires that we're having, but also the cyclical nature, the swings, the peaks and then the valleys between those. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. Some of them may be little more indirect than we may assume, but certainly very strongly climatically driven. And we're going to be talking a good amount about the climate drivers within the context of fires in the desert. Also, at the broad landscape level is the increase and the presence and the increase of invasive grasses as a driver of fire. And we can really, this is a paper by Fusco et al., and we're going to be sharing the links to a lot of the papers that we reference in this talk for all of you to access, that demonstrate really every community in the West is, especially in the arid regions of the West, is dealing with broad scale landscape presence of invasive species that are introduced species that are able to drive fires. And so again, the thinking, we're going to kind of be narrowing in a bit as we get into the deserts, but the role of fire and the fuels that can promote them and how that is changed in the recent decades with the expansion of introduced grasses especially is really quite kind of the driving force here. So to help kind of get our heads around what we're really going to be focusing kind of conceptually on today is this the term grassification. And I'll give you a brief definition here: a self-perpetuating grass fire cycle that progressively excludes native plants and results in grassification, the physiognomic conversion of shrublands to grasslands. Julio's going to go into a lot more detail to get at this, but it's essentially the grass fire cycle, that repetitive cycle of the phasing out the kind of ecosystem transformation and driven by grass species, and not necessarily just introduced as well. Within the desert, this is data from Gary Rogers and Schmidt that is from the Tonto Basin and the Tonto National Forest, and this is desperately in need of updating, which is some work we're going to be doing this fall. But you can see that even starting in the second half of the 20th century, that we had an increase, an uptick of fires in the desert. And so both in terms of the number of fires and the amount burned, and again, we see that cyclical nature, the peaks and valleys of this kind of up and down seesaw of the year-to-year variation. Within that, interestingly, through the year in the deserts, so on the bottom, you see the month, so 6 being June. And we have, again, the amount of area burned and the total number of fires. And in terms of the number of hectares burned, it's hard to get a more clear pattern than that, the fire season has Forrest Shreve defined the arid foresummer in the Sonoran Desert. After we had spring rains, the extreme drying and heating of the land that really starts late March through April, May, and by June, when you get the first monsoon storms building and a lot of dry lightning, that you get that's when you get the fire events. We know now, though, that primarily due to human-caused ignitions, fire sources or the ignition points are throughout the year. And with an increase of grassification, one of the expectations is that we're going to see kind of a leveling out and maybe a raising of those curves, and that fires are not necessarily limited to the arid forest summer, although that we do expect that to continue to be the primary season. To get at climate anomalies just a little bit and help again kind of set the context for what we're talking about later, this is a figure showing the INSO variation, and blues are essentially La Nina years, the reds are El Ninos, which in the greater Southwest is defined by high levels of precipitation in the cool season. And one thing we know is that in the last 20 or so years, especially during this drought that the greater Southwest is still currently within, when you do get the uptick of these El Nino precipitation events, those years that I have circled in black are big fire years. And Interestingly, then not all the El Ninos are associated with big fires, and perhaps that's something we can get into teasing out a little bit more in the discussion, and Julio can touch on. But certainly, 2005 and 2020 were major inflection points connected with the moisture we got, and then the drying out of the landscape. What is 2024 going to bring? We know that the El Nino is already presenting itself, developing. Uh, Expectations are for a wet winter, but what does that then mean for the drying season of next year? Expectations are that, unfortunately, it could be a heavy fire year. So that's kind of an initial framing of what we're going to be getting into. And I'd like to now pass the microphone over to Julio to describe a little bit more about the conceptual framework of grassification.
Thanks, Ben. I don't think I show up on the video, but that's fine. The first thing I wanted to say was that words actually matter. And we've been using in our group and a little beyond, we've been using this term grassification for a particular reason, because it captures exactly what's happening with grass invasions and altered wildfire regimes and the conversion of desert shrublands to flammable grasslands. It kind of reminds me of in climatology when the phrase atmospheric rivers was coined in the mid-1990s. And I'm sure you're aware of now that it's in the vernacular. You see it on the weather reports. And it's driven a lot of awareness and also a lot of science focused on these plumes of moist water vapor that ends up driving a lot of the precipitation and also a lot of the floods in Western North America, but also elsewhere. And so what we're proposing is that grassification should be a common term. We generally talk about grass invasions and altered wildfire regimes and the grass fire cycle, but grassification kind of nails what we're talking about. Next slide. Ben? So the opposite of grassification is, of course, shrubification. And it was first used to denote increased cover abundance biomass of local native shrubs in tundra. In other words, shrub invasion of the tundra, particularly with climate change. Next one, Ben. But in the Western U.S., we use this term shrubification to denote the encroachment of shrubs and trees into semi-arid grassland. And the cause primarily is a reduction of fine fuels by grazing and fire suppression. And it has a lot of impacts that have been studied by people like my friend Steve Archer at the University of Arizona. One of them is, the wholesale shift in biomass from mostly below ground to above ground, like shown in the picture there of Enchanted Mesa. Grassification, as Ben noted, is a conversion. One of the uses, probably the first use, was the conversion of tropical forest into pasture via biomass burning and the introduction of African grasses. In other words, this is happening all over the world. Next one. So here, we mean the conversion of desert shrublands into grasslands via non-native grass invasions and altered wildfire regimes, with all sorts of impacts, threats to threaten, endangered, and at-risk plants and animals, but also more dominant and iconic ones like Joshua tree and saguaros, changes to food webs, nutrient cycling and the transport, supply, and quality of water and sediment, compromises to protected lands and conservation efforts. In other words, why are we purchasing land for conservation when we actually can't protect it? communities, urban development, and infrastructure now have to plan around this novel and fast evolving risk, and then decreased property values, losses in tourism revenues, and escalating weed control and fire suppression budgets across the board. Next one, then. So among other things, I'm a paleoecologist, and so I think of the world kind of in deeper time than probably most of us. And I've always been struck by the abundance of bare soil in the Sonoran and Mojave Desert, which we generally attribute to the scarcity of precipitation. People have attributed to poor nitrogen availability, but that's been proven not to be true. And so I always think about these landscapes, and I know for a fact, and have studied this, that many of the plant associations in these deserts have not fully assembled until the last 5,000 years. So, in my mind, I have this question about whether these invasive grasses are rapidly invading perhaps unrealized evolutionary niche. And because when they do invade, that's, they start to cover those bare spaces. Next one, then. So again, on a paleo note, a couple of my colleagues, Rebecca Terry and Rebecca Rowe, we call them the Rebeccas, did this really beautiful study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on energy flow and functional compensation in Great Basin small mammals under natural and anthropogenic environmental change. And they did work at a place called Homestead Cave, which was actually wave cut by Pleistocene Lake Bonneville. It's now on, far from the shore of the Great Salt Lake. But this is a well-studied cave, well-studied cave deposits. And the two Rebeccas, what they did is they studied about 200,000 small mammal bones, mostly rodent bones, that were preserved in Alrus, from Alrus pellets that were deposited continuously in the cave. And they figured out this kind of clever way of measuring measuring energy flow in these rodent communities. And the moral of the story is that there was a lot of compensation occurring over the last 13,000 years, until you get, to the last 100, and then all of a sudden the community changes, reflecting basically the impacts of cheatgrass invasion. Next one, please. So I was asked to write a commentary for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on that paper, and I took the opportunity actually to use the term grassification. So I think this term should be in broad use, and I invite you to look at these papers. I think Rachel's provided the links to many of the papers we're going to mention. Next one, please. So I always use this particular slide when I give talks about grass invasions and other invasions. This is a logistic growth curve for invasions and intervention, with invader abundance and control costs on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And I'm amazed how infrequently people actually sit down with this particular diagram and discuss where things are with particular species in particular places. Where would you put the red brome invasion, depending on where you are? Where would you put the buffelgrass invasion, depending on where you are? And where are we with trying to control these species. I think that's super important to have these discussions broadly across the American West. Next one. So, of course, the thing that happens with these invasions is how time and invader abundance increase. So does the average fire size. For me, this very simple curve is a reminder of what I saw when I first moved to the Southwest from Texas, to Arizona from Texas. And that was in 1976. And I was kind of, a little bit at the bottom of the inflection of that curve at that time. And you were starting to see, fires that were thousands of acres in the Sonoran Desert. And now I think, particularly in central Arizona, you're kind of where that curve starts to flatten out. And so we're starting to reach the saturation point, throughout Arizona, Nevada, and Eastern California with red brome. Next one, please. So this has been driving now these huge fires. This is just a list of, some of the notable fires that have happened due to which species, red brome, cheatgrass. So there are these huge fires that, in some cases cover, 750,000 acres. Next one, please. So cutting to the chase are some questions that have always kind of occurred to me as I've thought about this problem of grassification and the fires the large fires that have been produced by it. The first one is an obvious one. And it's a battle cry for all of us. Can we reduce the size of the largest fire by one or more orders of magnitude and slow down the ecosystem transformation that we're experiencing? So can these large invasive-driven wildfires start and spread anywhere? Or their central tendencies in time and space? Can we use this central tendency to focus sustained treatments in the most likely areas that tend to initiate these largest fires? And, perhaps even more important, can we pool and bank resources from multiple jurisdictions to implement sustained treatments in these problematic areas? Next one. So I've had this slide for many, many years. I think there are many people probably listening now that remember it. Decisions. And so we haven't really had this conversation across the American West. Do we save desert shrublands or just resign ourselves to these flammable grasslands? Who makes the decision? With what consensus and authority? Can we overcome political obstacles and garner political will? How do we structure our governance, which is something that a group of us is studying right now with NSF support? Who bears the cost and responsibility? How we know whether we're failing and succeeding? And then if we fail or decide to do nothing, how the hell are we going to adapt? Next one. So I was in Tucson in April of this year. I live now in Reston, Virginia. And we went around on a walkabout visiting elected officials and administrators. And having conversations with them exactly about this problem. And most recently, we've come to the conclusion that there really has to be two approaches. We took this kind of approach with Buffelgrass in Pima County. So we did the Southern Arizona Buffelgrass Coordination Center in collaboration with Logan Simpson, did vulnerability, risk, and priority assessment associated with Buffelgrass invasion. But it was a one-off. We didn't do it again. We didn't update it. We didn't keep it going. And so I think a solution or an approach to the problem we have with grassification is that we need to do this lots of places throughout the West, probably with very similar decision support models, and mapping efforts to identify, places where health, life, and property are at risk, and also where natural resources are at risk. And then, we need to figure out, probably separately, what funding streams are available to actually do this. Next one. So I want to hazard some predictions for the rest of the 21st century if we fail to manage these invasive species. I think it's clearly on the way, but cheatgrass and its associated wildfires are decimating sagebrush steppe, particularly on the dry end. And this is going to continue to happen. With larger forest fires that we're experiencing throughout the Rockies, expect cheatgrass and smooth brome to spread much higher up in the mountains. The large fires driven by red brome and other winter annuals, I think, will succeed in denuding the Mojave Desert and northwestern Sonoran Desert, and many parts of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts will convert to buffelgrass and other non-native grasses, and this is already well on its way in Sonora and parts of Chihuahua in Mexico. Now, relative to what Ben was saying about the El Nino Southern Oscillation, El Nino La Nina, now what we're going to have is basically a wholesale change in the fire mosaic, with ignition fronts in desert valleys spreading upslope, finding the driest woody fuels at the bottom of the mountain, and then moving on up even higher into our forest. And these are areas that burned in the past, burned mostly during La Nina events. And I expect that they're going to be also burning during El Nino events because of these ignition fronts coming from the valleys. I think given high population densities and rates of human ignitions in desert valleys, we're gonna probably see Lahaina events in the American West, and there's currently no real discussion about how to prevent this. Next one, Ben. So here's the Lahaina fire. I think everybody knows quite a bit about it. The one thing I do want to mention here is that officials very quickly blamed climate change for this, and this would have happened with or without climate change. Much like the grassification that we're experiencing, while it may be complicated a little bit by climate change, it's going to happen regardless. So I think people have to kind of avoid blaming this particular phenomenon on climate change while acknowledging that there are some complexities. Next one. I want to end with this slide because when I was in Tucson, it was on the heels of what was happening in Central Australia, where buffelgrass fueled a wildland fire that burned 250,000 acres, or a quarter of this Chorcha West McDonald National Park, not far from here. This is just west of Alex Springs. And in 2000, I fell off a cliff doing field work in the East McDowell, the McDonald Mountains, and was in the hospital with a broken leg for about 3 weeks. Adding insult to injury, I landed close to a little patch of buffelgrass. So I remember in 2000, buffelgrass was definitely invading at that time, and you could see it in places like the Alice Springs Airport. But I don't think it was as prevalent as it's become, almost, 23, 24 years later. And so if you think this can't happen in our neck of the woods, I think you're probably wrong. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Okay, Ben.
Thanks, Julio. All right. To zoom in a little bit to help us understand kind of what we used as a case study to see where we are, I think, on that inflection curve Julio presented within the fire cycle here in the desert. We looked at the 2020 Bighorn Fire. And for me, this was definitely a wake-up call. And I think it was actually a literal wake-up call for Julio when it was about 3 a.m. our time maybe he was just not quite up yet on the East Coast. And I said, Julio, it's happening. The fire is coming down into the desert. And this is kind of image that captured that. And in short, I'll kind of cut to the chase now. The Bighorn Fire was a near miss for the desert, and then I'll explain why in a little bit. But within 2020, there was not the only fire happening by no means. This is an image of the Tonto National Forest and the bushfire that's happening. Larger than the Bighorn Fire, almost 200,000 acres. You can see a lot of lowland, a lot of desert burned. Ken Franklin, who's going to speak in a little bit, shared that Mary Lata has a figure that over about a quarter of the Tonto desert areas have burned in the last several years, which is thinking about the larger time scale, that's a lot. That's a high percentage. Also, at this time was the Dome Fire and Joshua Tree National Forest, and kind of just thinking about the iconic species status and keystone species that we kind of consider as saguaro. The same thing with Joshua Tree, and huge numbers were lost. March of 2020, I don't know if many of you remember, here in the greater Southwest, was a very wet year. This is an image. Here is Phoenix, here is Tucson, the NDVI. So the green is growing vegetation. I was out here looking at the wildflowers in Catalina State Park. It was beautiful. But then the arid forest summer sets in, as it does. And by June, all that growth in the desert lowlands had dried out. And subsequently, we had the fire season. So this is the simultaneous burning of the Bighorn Fire and the bush fire. I'm going to quickly give an overview of the Bighorn Fire just so you can kind of understand its dynamics. It started on Push Ridge area with a lightning strike in the evening, quickly driven by winds down to the east, and then pushed strong up to the rest of the Catalina Range and grew fast. And this was 2020 was kind of the, I would hope that we never eclipse it with having a worse summer. It was truly the summer from hell with COVID raging, no monsoon or the non-soon season. And so the fire was able to just push on and drive without any moisture. This is a flight overview. We're here over Catalina State Park, and you can see a lot of the burning of the lowlands there. Now we're pushing a little bit more to the east and kind of following the direction that the fire took as it went through the mountain range, being pushed by the predominant winds. And again, the lack of moisture to really do anything about it. Normally, I think a June fire would kind of peter out with the moisture coming in July, middle of July, but this pretty much burned through the month of July. We're approaching now here the kind of peaks of the mountain, and you can see the green areas, the infrastructure there around Summer Haven. This is the satellite and the telecommunications. A huge amount of resources were put in to control and to not let the fire burn the resources in the community of Summer Haven you see there, which did burn in the 2003 Aspen fire, I believe. And now we're continuing off to the east, where the fire kind of continued to push and move through the rest of that horrific summer. This is an overview map of the impact of the fire, just to kind of show you the different biotic regions that it burned in, the red in this case being desert scrub. And I want to zoom in here a little bit, and this is kind of really a fairly good representative image. This was taken some months after the fire. You can see the burned yuccas here on below. And this is really what the low kind of bottom edge of the fire perimeter looks like, which is kind of marked by a pretty modest fuel break, that where the fire petered out. It was going downhill at night, so it didn't have much activity. And in this case, essentially a trail was able to be used as essentially de facto fire break, which is something that we can maybe explore a little more in terms of management options here. I think we have the advantageous situation of the fire working downhill and at night, right? I think it's a very different story if it's moving uphill during the day when it would have a lot more energy. Critically, essentially, the large paddocks of buffelgrass, or the large pockets of buffelgrass, were below where the fire was happening. You can see in this image, buffelgrass patches, as mapped by Aaron Olson, are seen here in the kind of turquoise green color. The red is the fire perimeter, and certainly patches of bufflegrass did burn, but it was not the driving fuel source. That was really native annuals that came up. And these are other not introduced species, especially layman's lovegrass was a major driver of that fire, but it was a mix of native and introduced species. And, and essentially the main concentration of bufflegrass is more at this 1,000-foot, kind of this lower foothills. And where you saw the edge of the fire was predominantly that 4,000-foot layer, 1,000-meter and 1,200-meter, that 4,000-foot zone, which is that desert grassland transition zone. And so when I say near miss, what I essentially mean is that there was not the field cut activity that brought the fire down into the desert. That is something that we think is a snapshot in time, and we definitely cannot take for granted. Just a quick couple images to help give you a sense of what the change is looking like down in the desert lowlands where it did burn. So these are images from long-term plots I set up in the burn areas in Catalina State Park area, so on the western edge of the Catalina Mountains. This is immediately after the fire, just a couple months after in 2020, and then combined with the image then after 2 summer rainy seasons of 2021 and 2022. And just to show that briefly again, you can see the loss of the palo verdes and the increase in this case of layman's lovegrass. An adjacent plot showing the ocotillo and the palo verdes burned out, and then the subsequent loss of that overstory of leguminous trees and the ocotillos and a full-scale encroachment of the grass fire cycle with layman's coming out very strong. Similar thing here, looking upslope towards the Catalinas, and then the increase. You can see in this image, though, the resprouting of species, which I'm going to talk on in just a second. At the species level, within these plots, definitely a reduced species richness within the burned areas compared to controlled treatments of non-burned areas out, both in the grassland and the desert scrubland. This is a list of species, and either if they died out or regrew. The ones with gray bars have resprouting, and the black lines were died out. I'm just going to kind of call your attention to and call out some plant friends here that had, honestly, to me, quite unexpected levels of regrowth. We have Chromaria, Jatropha or limberbush, which is a succulent coming back from below ground growth. Certain palo verdes did have capacity to regrow. Fairy duster, Caliandra, Iania, a shrub, Acacia, Celtis, and mesquites as expected. And that was both in the burned and unburned areas. So essentially one of the takeaways from this initial data in the plots is that there's a lot of a resilience within the flora of capacity to recover after fire. I think one of the big questions is if you have recurring fires, you saw the amount of layman's lovegrass there, will you continue to see this resilience? And my expectations would be you would not. That was a quick overview of some of the dynamics of the Bighorn Fire and kind of how we can understand the changing role of fire in the desert. At this point, I want to introduce Catherine Jarnovich and to have her help us understand the role fire modeling can have to help us kind of get heads around the future of fire in the desert.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm going to talk about specific to Buffelgrass, some modeling work that I did with several others that I have listed here. Next slide. So Ben already gave a good overview of Buffelgrass, and so again, this work is really focused on this species and its invasion in the area around Tucson, based on managers concerned about its potential to transform the fire regimes in these desert ecosystems. Next slide. So the tool that we used to explore the dynamics of Buffelgrass and fire was state and transition models. So these are box and arrow diagrams where you can assign the landscape to different states or the boxes. So you could think of a forest where you have deciduous trees, mixed trees, coniferous trees, and you have succession moving into those different states. And then you could also have fire that might revert it back to a previous state. Next slide. So thinking specifically about invasive species, there's a lot of different questions that we could potentially answer with these types of models. And what I'm going to focus on now is kind of how big is the problem related to buffelgrass? How much might there be on the landscape, and how might it interact with fire to really alter ecosystem processes? But there's other work that we did in Saguaro National Park looking at alternative management strategies in relation to these problems as well. Next slide. So kind of the framework that we used was developing these models using information from expert workshops, as well as additional data that we were able to collect, such as where buffelgrass occurred on the landscape, weather information, fuel models from land fire. And then we combine this information with a state and transition simulation model that we dynamically linked to a far site fire behavior model, so that the two could interact at each time step and you could have feedbacks between them. Next slide. So this is the model that we were really working with, where moving from left to right, you have an increase in buffelgrass on the landscape from uninvaded states up to greater than 50% cover of buffelgrass. And then when fires did occur at those larger infested areas, we moved it into a converted state, thinking that when you have a fire in those buffelgrass invaded areas, that you lose a lot of that native vegetation. That would take a lot more to get it back, similar to the pictures that Ben showed. Next slide. And then how we integrated it with the far site was we used the land fire fuel models to assign fuel loads to the landscape. And then we also assigned buffelgrass cover classes to those fuel models. Next slide. And so we ran these simulations in the Santa Catalina Mountains in that area of the Bighorn Fire. And what we're showing here is on the top, we ran simulations with buffelgrass on the landscape, but we also ran another set without buffelgrass, where we used only those land fire fuel model classes to define the landscape. And so what you can see here is that the cumulative area burned was greater when we had buffelgrass on the landscape than without. And focusing in on that right graph, we also looked at just areas below that 1,200 meter area that Ben described earlier. That's kind of that ecological transition to the desert scrub area. And also is where you get more into that wildland urban interface. And then along the bottom, those graphics, each dot represents a fire with the colors representing different iterations to capture stochasticity in where fires occurred and how large they were. And we ran this simulation for 30 years, and again, with buffelgrass on the left, without on the right. And so when we had buffelgrass on the landscape, you end up with a lot larger fires when you have more buffelgrass on the landscape. Next slide. And I just wanted to show this graphic from running similar simulations in Saguaro National Park, which is to the east and west of Tucson. And in this, we also considered uncertainties in how quickly buffelgrass might infill. So how, once it's established, how quickly might it reach higher cover classes, including considerations of how wet the climate is. And again, here there was large interannual variability, but several years resulted in fires, and fire size increased with invaded area. Next slide. And then the last thing I wanted to point out was another thing that we looked at within Saguaro National Park was we have the desert ecosystem that historically hadn't ever had fires moving from that up into the higher elevation forests. Whereas in these simulations, when we increasing buffelgrass over time, we did have fires moving uphill into those areas, as well as the potential for them to move down to lower elevations. Next slide. So we use the combination of these two models, the state and transition simulation modeling and Fireside, to simulate these novel ecological processes and to show that buffelgrass could potentially have a large effect on fire dynamics. And now I will pass it on to Kim.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. And I'm going to be super fast so that we have time for questions. So I'm going to just breeze through these slides. Go to the next slide, Ben. So I am talking about current management challenges and the successes that we've had. And I decided to sort of structure this piece of the talk around Julio's decisions slide. And the first question there, next slide, is do we save desert shrublands or resign ourselves to combustible grasslands? So this decision is being made currently individually by jurisdiction. And so, for instance, Saguaro National Park is very much committed to saving the desert shrublands. And one of our successes is that we do know how to treat buffelgrass effectively. And you can see a site on the left that was treated manually and chemically both. And in 2012, that it's looking more like its previous state. Next slide. But these decisions on whether or not we save it and which species do we control and where do we prioritize treatment, they're all taking place individually. So we live in a very jurisdictionally complex landscape, and those with authority over individual jurisdictions are deciding whether or not we do anything, if they're even making that decision consciously, and then what we do. And as Julio has said, if you've seen talks by him in the past, that the future really hinges on how well we manage these spatially extensive and sometimes contagious environmental problems across multiple jurisdictions. Next slide. I think one of our success stories on that note is that we've building on the foundations laid by the Southern Arizona Buffelgrass Coordination Center. We founded the Sonoran Desert Cooperative Weed Management Area, myself with community partners, in 2018. And so this brings together federal, state, local agencies, tribes, NGOs, scientists from academia, and as well as some private industry. And we don't have financial resources to hand out, but we do have information. We share successes, failures, we develop collaborations, we sustain morale. Given that this ongoing problem continues to grow, I think that's a really important function of this group. And we've had tremendous precipitation since we've founded it in 2018. Next slide. But another thing that we need in order to be able to prioritize treatment is knowledge of the distribution of these grasses. So I'm just going to talk about buffelgrass in particular. Next slide. And this is one area where I'm particularly hopeful, because with recent advances in satellite imagery, all the imagery that you see of these natural disasters that are occurring on what seems like an almost daily basis sometimes are coming out from companies like Maxar and Planet. We are increasing our ability to image the planet at very high spatial resolution and very high temporal resolution very quickly. And in addition, there's just an incredible imagery available for free, say on Google Earth. And so I'm working with Aaron Olson, some of you may know him, to map buffelgrass, beginning with manual interpretation. So we're using Google Earth imagery. Next slide. And we hope to eventually be able to apply AI to this. And so here you see an area near Pima Canyon. So this is the Catalina foothills. The solid red is areas of buffelgrass mapped by Aaron Olson in 2017. The outlined areas are this buffelgrass patches mapped by Aaron again, but this time in 2023. And so you can see the growth of those patches, how they grow with these sort of amoeba-like shapes and then coalesce with each other. So I'm very hopeful about the mapping, the ability of these advances to provide us with better data than we've ever had on the distribution of buffelgrass. Next slide. And then it will also help us with our lack of capacity to evaluate treatment effectiveness either immediately, right after the treatment takes place, as well as to monitor progress over time to be able to map on these landscape scales. And there's more interesting stuff going on in this realm that I'm going to skip right now in the interest of time. Next slide. Who makes these decisions and with what consensus and authority? Well, it's fairly simple. If you're in Saguaro National Park, Saguaro National Park has the authority there. But it becomes more challenging when you move to a larger scale. And if you're thinking about the state scale, how does the state distribute funding to fight both wildfire risk for communities and for natural resources? This is an image of the Arizona Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal. Go ahead, Ben. And it's really complicated within the urban environment. I just wanted to mention that buffelgrass is an urban problem as well. There's buffelgrass in the south side of Tucson, and there's a motorcycle shop at Grant and First in Tucson that burned down as a result of a buffelgrass fire. Next slide. And I'm just gonna quickly skip through this. One of the other problems is that there are new invasives arriving like stinknet, you see there in the photo on the right. And we don't have a good system of early detection and rapid response, nor do we have a system where we can aggregate data across jurisdictions. Next slide. How do we garner political will? I think we have the political will at this moment in time, not that it will be here indefinitely, but there is a tremendous amount of funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act for this type of work, restoration work. The state has also increased funding, but we haven't overcome the problem that funding is inconsistent and unpredictable over time. And so right now we're in this really excellent time where there's a lot of funding. Next slide. But we don't expect it to last. We'll skip this one. How much will this cost and what are we willing to pay? So, we have all this funding, but I think one of the biggest challenges we face is that we don't have the contractors. There's simply not enough contractors to hire to spend the funding to treat the buffelgrass. I don't know how much it will cost, but I do know that in just 5 years, the price of treating an acre of buffelgrass has gone from about $200 an acre to over $2,000 an acre. And that has a lot to do with the labor supply issues. There aren't enough contractors out there, and the ones that exist are having trouble finding labor. And also that people have recognized this is some of the hardest, most physically demanding work that you can ask someone to do. And so people want to be paid more. Next slide. And then there's also other treatments that are more expensive, such as aerial treatments, which will, if you have questions about that, please send me an email or we can chat about that later. And I think my last slide, so we have a little time. Just wanted to end on a really positive note is that we have a tremendous number of volunteers who are so committed to stewardship of this landscape, nearly 10,000 volunteer hours every year just in Tucson Mountain Park by a group known the Weed Whackers, and Saguaro National Park is relying more and more on volunteers, and there are volunteers working across the Tucson Basin. And so they continue to be an important part of the answer to how we're going to manage these desert landscapes into the future. And with that, I think we still have a couple minutes for questions.
Thanks, Kim. I mean, so just kind of to try to put a summary on this, and then thanks for staying with us, and we're able to stay longer if any of you have questions for conversation. How do we conceptualize and prepare for kind of the future where we're shifting from a situation where fires pretty much stayed up in the highlands, in the Skyline region or throughout the West, and were quite rare to infrequent in the desert lowlands, to a near future and maybe even the present where, and this is again why the Bighorn Fire was a near miss, right? There wasn't that continuity of fuels at that point in time, which is rapidly changing between the lowlands and the highlands, where fires can shift up and down. And I think a great fear is starting down and moving up, and this increase of urbanization at the wildland-urban interface. So hopefully we've been able to help provide a little more context to what we know and what we can expect in the future, and some of the ways that we can be proactive in terms of addressing the change afoot. So please invite all the speakers to come on now and And Rachel, thanks so much, and we'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for a wonderful presentation and for tying it up so well. I know that we still have a lot of unanswered questions, so we'll jump into some of the questions that have popped up in the chat. Tim was wondering, sort of a tangential question, can you share any data on increases in rodent populations in some of these grassified areas?
Tim, do you want to maybe field that first, or I would think you and Julio maybe have the best information on that.
Yeah, if you have good information, Julio, I don't have data, but there is anecdotally, many people report that cacti, especially saguaros, in areas that are now heavily infested with buffelgrass, are chewed away at their bases as if rodents are nibbling on these plants. And yeah, I don't know that anyone has actually tried to quantify rodent populations in these areas.
I'm aware of a paper that just came out for Sonora, the Southwestern Naturalist. I'll try to, I'm not too familiar with it, but I just actually saw it this morning, so I can maybe share that later.
Okay, and Julio also just posted in the chat that the paper that we referenced from 2015 by Terry and Rowe showed increases in small granivore rodents with cheatgrass invasion.
I also wanted to add that there are a lot of places where we've actually done, not we, but I mean, kind of the royal we, where people have done lots of monitoring and studies on rodents. And it's a matter of finding where those places are where you have conversion because of grassification, where you actually have some baselines. You know, I'm guessing there are lots of those places, but I don't think anybody's looked at that systematically.
Okay, thank you. Laura was wondering if you can share your thoughts on invasive plants taking over fuel breaks. They mentioned that stinknet is one that appears to be taking advantage of the vacant soil.
I can start with that, and then I'd love other thoughts too. I would say that one of the things I think I was encouraged by in seeing in just some preliminary dynamics of fires in the desert is how effective field breaks are. So I think, yes, it's a concern that they're maybe taking over. And if you're looking where to focus management efforts, I think that's a very low-hanging fruit and easily accomplished task by maintaining those field breaks as opposed to maintaining a whole landscape level, right? If you're trying to prioritize the control of fuel and fire movement, I think that's a strong place to start. Anyone want to add anything?
I mean, I would just add that, yeah, I think fire break maintenance becomes a forever task, something that we're always going to be doing. We have to think of these grass problems as like we think of road maintenance.
Yeah, I did want to add, living in the eastern U.S., that people in the Southwest and in southwestern deserts don't realize that for decades we've dodged a bullet of vegetation management simply because it's the desert. We just leave it that way, and it doesn't require much maintenance. But I live in the leafy suburbs of Northern Virginia, and trust me that there's a military industrial complex of vegetation management here with billions of dollars spent every year on vegetation management. So while we may feel sorry for ourselves that this is happening, I think it's one of those things that, you want to solve the problem, it's going to require, people to spend money.
Yeah, I really appreciate that insight, Julio, and pointing out what's going to need to happen in the near future if we want to address this problem. I'm going to let us go just a few more minutes if anyone has additional questions that they want to ask. In the meantime, Kim, I wanted to kind of go off of what you were just talking about. And in your portion of the presentation, you spoke to distribution modeling and mapping. I'm wondering, how can these tools be implemented to select priority areas for conversion resistance or direction management? Going a little bit into what you were talking about with like fuel break maintenance and how this is going to be an ongoing thing in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just recently talked to a bunch of land managers, Saguaro National Park, Pima County, and asked, was discussing how they prioritize where they're going to treat. And a lot of it right now, they do look at the data that they have mapped when that data exists. A lot of it is that these land managers have worked in these landscapes and know them so well for so long, and they have picked out areas that, for whatever reason, environmental or cultural value are high priority, and they've treated them once and they're going to go back, and so they're high priority to treat again. But I do think that we can, as we are able to get data at the scale that land managers need, a lot of these wildfire risk models are at very large scales, and managers need something that's a finer scale to be able to use it. And then more and more data can feed into those models. As you were saying, maybe some areas we are just destined to be buffelgrass. It would require such an enormous input of resources that we decide that we're going to let that go. But it would be nice to be able to make those decisions consciously, and not just, kind of going with the way the wind blows. Julio's been talking with some companies. One is called Vibrant Planet, which do this type of work. And they have great potential. They have great sources of data. They're pulling, experts from academia and from Silicon Valley, and building these tools that will really give land managers a lot more power to make informed decisions. And so I think that is, something that we're going to look into in the future for how we're going to deal with these types of problems. I don't know if you want to add anything about your recent conversation with Vibrant Planet, Julio.
No, they're extremely impressive group. The CEO was somebody that was instrumental in starting Netflix. So, Silicon Valley person that is extremely competent and charismatic, and their staff is amazing. I know a number of those people, and I saw a presentation by them, and I was super impressed. I did want to make the point that, and I'm sure that Catherine will agree with this, there are more decision support models than people using them. And, the problem with that is that for a problem like this, we can't create 100 different decision support models. If we do, we're going to fail. The best thing to do is, to kind of settle, on a few and make sure they're viral, make sure and promote them as such. Where you start solving problems in one area, and you're always aware that those models have application elsewhere, and then promoting that application elsewhere. I think that's super important in our field, not just with, grass invasions and altered wildfire regimes, but all sorts of things.
All right, I really appreciate you making that last point, Julio. So I don't see any more questions coming in. We're a little bit over time, so we'll go ahead and end it here. But I wanted to thank all four of you again so much for coming on and giving this wonderful presentation today, for giving us your time, and thank you to everyone who joined us. I look forward to seeing where this research goes in the future.
Thanks so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, be well.